for members of Congress is the solemn act to take an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. With great respect and gratitude that I thank the chairs of the committees, the 6 committees who have been working to help us honor our oath of office. I also want to thank the staff of those committees and the committee members for all of their work over this period of time to help us protect and defend. I want to thank the Chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Nadler, Chair of the Intelligence Committee, Mr. Schiff, Chair of the Ways and Means Committee.
Okay, so this is absolutely massive, and I need you to pay close attention because what is reportedly happening right now goes to the very heart of the debate over whether Trump's agenda can be countered before, as some critics allege, he completely transforms the American government. House Democrats have filed formal articles of impeachment against President Trump. Not just one set, but multiple resolutions accusing him of high crimes and misdemeanors that they say make him unfit to serve as president. And at the same time, outside groups are ramping up pressure on his own cabinet to use the 25th Amendment as a last resort if Congress refuses to act. We are talking about the most extreme constitutional tools available being openly discussed as ways to remove a sitting...
So Donald Trump just had an absolutely catastrophic meltdown in federal court, and we're not talking about your typical courtroom drama here. This wasn't just some heated exchange or a sharp comment that got a little out of hand. What happened in that courtroom represents something far more serious, something that legal experts are calling unprecedented for a former president and current political figure. Trump's behavior became so disruptive, so beyond the pale, that the judge had no choice but to take extraordinary action. And the fallout from this moment is going to reverberate through his legal cases, his political future, and the entire 2026 election cycle. This is the kind of incident that doesn't just make headlines for a day or two and then disappear. This is the kind of moment that fundamentally alters how judges, prosecutors, and even his own legal team approach every single interaction with him moving forward. And here's what makes this even more significant. This happened in front of the jury, in front of the press, in front of cameras that captured every single second of what can only be described as a complete loss of composure from someone who's trying to project strength and control. The optics are brutal, the legal implications are massive, and the political consequences are going to haunt Trump's campaign for months to come. Now, before we get into exactly what went down in that courtroom and why this matters so much more than it might appear on the surface, let's talk about something important. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore to give you the full picture on stories like this. They'll show you the sensational moment, they'll give you the soundbite, but they won't connect the dots on what this actually means for the balance of power, for Trump's legal strategy, for the institutional guardrails that are supposed to keep anyone, even a former president, accountable to the rule of law. That's why we built this channel, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines and understand what's really happening before everyone else catches on, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day, breaking down exactly what matters and why. Just click the link in the description to join, and if you just want to support what we're doing here, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth and isn't afraid to call out power when it oversteps. All right, let's get back to the video. Here's what happened. Trump was in federal court facing charges related to his handling of classified documents, charges that carry serious prison time and that go to the heart of national security law. This wasn't a civil case where the worst outcome is a fine. This was a criminal proceeding where Trump is facing the possibility of conviction on felony counts, and the evidence against him has been mounting for months. The judge presiding over the case, a George W. Bush appointee with a reputation for running a tight courtroom and not tolerating any nonsense from anyone regardless of their status or position, had already warned Trump's legal team multiple times about courtroom decorum. Trump had been testing the boundaries for weeks, making comments under his breath, shaking his head dramatically during witness testimony, and generally treating the proceedings like they were some kind of political rally where he could play to an audience, rather than a serious legal matter where his freedom is literally on the line. But on this particular day, something snapped. During a key moment in the prosecution's case, When a witness was testifying about Trump's direct involvement in obstructing federal investigators and refusing to comply with subpoenas, Trump suddenly stood up from the defense table and started shouting at the witness, calling the testimony lies, calling the whole proceeding a witch hunt, and launching into what can only be described as a campaign speech right there in the middle of the trial. His own lawyers immediately tried to get him to sit down, physically tugging at his jacket and whispering urgently. But Trump shoved one of them aside and kept going, his voice getting louder, his face getting redder, pointing at the judge and saying this whole thing was rigged, that the judge was corrupt, that the prosecutor was a political operative. The courtroom went completely silent, except for Trump's voice echoing off the walls. The jury sat there stunned. The judge, who had been patient up until that point, slammed the gavel down and ordered Trump to sit down and be quiet. Trump ignored him. The judge repeated the order, his voice now sharp and commanding. Trump still didn't stop. And that's when the judge did something that almost never happens in an American courtroom, something that legal historians are going to be talking about for decades. He ordered the bailiffs to remove Trump from the courtroom immediately. What happened next was captured on video, and it's already gone viral. 2 U.S. Marshals approached Trump, and for a moment it looked like Trump was going to resist physically, but his lawyers surrounded him, basically forming a human barrier, and after a tense 30 seconds where everyone in that courtroom was holding their breath, wondering if this was about to turn into an actual physical confrontation, Trump finally allowed himself to be escorted out. But even as he was being walked toward the exit, he was still yelling, still pointing back at the judge, still calling the whole thing a sham. The doors closed behind him, and the courtroom sat in absolute stunned silence for what felt like forever before the judge addressed the jury, instructing them to disregard Trump's outburst and to focus solely on the evidence presented according to the law. The judge then called a recess and went into chambers with the prosecutors and Trump's legal team to discuss what happens next, because this isn't just a minor disruption. This is a defendant in a federal criminal trial openly defying a judge's direct order, engaging in behavior that could constitute contempt of court, and doing it all in front of the jury that's supposed to be deciding his fate based on evidence and law, not on theatrics and outbursts. And this is where things start to unravel in ways that go far beyond just this one trial. Because what Trump did in that courtroom isn't just bad optics or a momentary lapse in judgment. It's a direct challenge to the authority of the federal judiciary, and judges do not take that lightly. The judge in this case now has several options, none of them good for Trump. He could hold Trump in contempt of court, which would mean fines or even jail time until Trump agrees to comply with courtroom rules. He could revoke Trump's bail and order him detained for the remainder of the trial, arguing that his behavior demonstrates he's not willing to follow the conditions of his release. He could impose a gag order that's even more restrictive than what's already in place, essentially barring Trump from speaking about the case at all, even outside the courtroom. Or he could do all three. And here's the thing that Trump and his team clearly didn't think through. Federal judges have enormous power to control their courtrooms, and they have the full weight of the U.S. Marshal Service and the federal prison system behind them to enforce their orders. Trump might be used to getting away with defying norms, ignoring subpoenas and dragging out litigation in civil courts where the worst that happens is he pays a settlement. But criminal court is a completely different beast. In criminal court, the judge has the power to put you in a cell, and there's no amount of money or political posturing that changes that fundamental reality. Now let's break down what this actually means, because the implications here go way beyond just one bad day in court. First, understand that Trump's entire legal strategy across all of his cases has been built on delay, distraction, and delegitimization. He wants to push every trial past the 2026 midterms, ideally past the 2028 presidential election, so that he can either win back the White House and potentially shut down federal prosecutions against him, or at least use the trials as a rallying cry for his base, painting himself as a victim of political persecution. But that strategy only works if he can maintain some level of control over the narrative, if he can keep positioning himself as the strong leader being attacked by corrupt institutions. What happened in that courtroom completely undermines that narrative. Because here's what voters saw. Not a strong leader standing up to corruption, but a defendant who couldn't control his temper, who got physically removed from a courtroom by federal marshals, who was so out of control that his own lawyers couldn't stop him. That's not strength, that's chaos. That's someone who fundamentally cannot handle the pressure of being held accountable under the law. And for voters who are already on the fence about Trump, who maybe voted for him in 2016 or even 2020, but have been getting tired of the constant drama, this is exactly the kind of moment that pushes them away for good. Second, this incident gives prosecutors in every single one of Trump's cases a massive gift. They can now point to this moment as evidence that Trump has no respect for the judicial process, that he's willing to obstruct justice even in the middle of a trial, that he's a threat to the orderly administration of the law. In the classified documents case, prosecutors have been arguing that Trump knowingly obstructed investigators and refused to return classified materials because he believed he was above the law. Well, Trump just stood up in court and demonstrated exactly that mindset in real time for everyone to see. In the January 6th case, prosecutors are arguing that Trump has a pattern of inciting violence and chaos when things don't go his way. Again, Trump just gave them a perfect example of that pattern playing out in a federal courtroom. Every prosecutor working on a Trump case just got handed a clip they can use to argue for stricter conditions, for faster trial dates, for harsher sentences if there's a conviction. Trump basically just made every prosecutor's job easier. Third, this is going to have a ripple effect on how judges in all of Trump's other cases handle him going forward. Judges talk to each other. They see what's happening in other courtrooms. And what they just saw is that giving Trump the benefit of the doubt, trying to treat him like any other defendant with some leeway for the fact that he's a public figure, doesn't work. He doesn't respect it. He uses it as an opportunity to push boundaries further. So now, every judge who has a Trump case on their docket is going to be thinking about what happened in that courtroom and asking themselves, do I want that circus in my courtroom? The answer is going to be no, which means stricter gag orders, less tolerance for delays, faster movement toward trial dates, and a much harder line on any attempts by Trump or his lawyers to play games with the process. Trump just made every single one of his legal battles significantly harder for himself. Fourth, let's talk about what this does to Trump's political standing heading into 2026. The midterm elections are less than 2 years away, and control of the House and Senate is absolutely critical for Trump's political future. If Democrats can hold the Senate or even flip the House, they can block Trump's agenda. They can investigate his administration if he wins in 2028. They can provide a check on executive power that Trump has made very clear he doesn't want to deal with. Republicans need to win big in 2026 to give Trump a clear path, and that means they need to appeal to moderate voters, suburban voters, independent voters who swung away from Republicans in 2022 and 2024 because they were exhausted by Trump's chaos. Well, this courtroom incident is going to be in every single Democratic campaign ad from now until Election Day. Is this the leadership you want? A man who gets dragged out of court for throwing a tantrum? A man who can't even control himself in front of a judge? It's devastating imagery, and it plays directly into the narrative that Trump is unfit for leadership, that he's too unstable, too consumed by his own grievances to actually govern. For Republicans running in swing districts, this is a nightmare. They're going to have to answer for Trump's behavior over and over again, and every time they do, they lose a few more moderate voters who might have been willing to vote Republican but can't stomach the chaos anymore. Fifth, think about what this means for Trump's fundraising and his legal defense fund. Trump has been raising enormous amounts of money off his legal battles, telling his supporters that he's being persecuted and that he needs their help to fight back. And that strategy has worked to a degree, bringing in tens of millions of dollars that Trump has used to pay legal fees, fund his political operation, and keep his campaign infrastructure alive. But there's a limit to how much chaos and dysfunction his donors are willing to bankroll. Major Republican donors, the kind of people who write six-figure and seven-figure checks, are not interested in funding a candidate who gets thrown out of court. They want stability. They want competence. They want someone who can win elections and advance their policy priorities. Getting dragged out of a courtroom by federal marshals is the opposite of that. So while Trump might still be able to pull small-dollar donations from his hardcore base, the big money is going to start looking for alternatives. And that's a huge problem for him because legal defense in multiple federal cases is extraordinarily expensive. The big donors start walking away. Trump's going to have to choose between paying his legal bills and funding his political operation, and neither option is good. Sixth, let's talk about what this does to the jury in this specific case. The judge instructed them to disregard Trump's outburst and focus only on the evidence. But come on, that's not how human psychology works. That jury just watched the defendant completely lose control, defy the judge, get physically removed from the courtroom. Even if they're trying their best to be impartial, that's going to be in the back of their minds when they're deliberating. It's going to color how they view Trump's testimony if he chooses to take the stand, which his lawyers are now almost certainly going to advise him not to do, because who knows what he might say or do up there. It's going to affect how they interpret the evidence about obstruction and defiance of federal authority, because they just saw him obstruct and defy federal authority in real time. Prosecutors couldn't have asked for a better demonstration of Trump's state of mind and his attitude toward the law, and jurors are going to remember that when they're in the deliberation room deciding whether to convict. Seventh, this raises serious questions about Trump's mental state and his fitness to stand trial. Now, his lawyers aren't going to argue that publicly because Trump would never allow it, but privately, there are going to be conversations about whether Trump is psychologically capable of assisting in his own defense, which is a legal requirement for someone to stand trial. If a defendant is so unstable that they can't control their behavior in court, can't work with their lawyers, can't follow basic courtroom rules, then there's an argument to be made that they're not competent to stand trial. That's a double-edged sword for Trump, because on one hand it could delay the trial, which is what he wants, but on the other hand it would involve psychiatric evaluations, court-appointed doctors, potential medication requirements, and a public acknowledgement that Trump is not mentally fit, which would be absolutely devastating to his political image. So his lawyers are stuck between wanting to use any tool they can to delay the trial and not wanting to go down a road that ends with Trump being declared incompetent, because once you open that door, it's very hard to close it. Eighth, let's zoom out to the international level for a moment, because this matters there too. Trump is running for president again in 2028, and a huge part of his pitch is that he's the strong leader who can deal with adversaries like China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. He's the guy who can sit across the table from Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin and hold his own. But every foreign leader and their intelligence services just watch Trump lose control in a courtroom and get physically removed by marshals. That's not strength, that's volatility, that's someone who can't handle pressure. And if you're a foreign leader deciding how to deal with the United States, that kind of instability is incredibly useful information. It tells you that Trump can be provoked. It tells you that if you push him hard enough, he'll lash out in ways that aren't strategic. It tells you that he's driven by ego and emotion rather than calculated national interest. So adversaries are going to test him more, and allies are going to trust him less because nobody wants to tie their security and their economy to a leader who might blow up a negotiation or a summit because he got angry. Ninth, think about what this means for the rule of law and the broader constitutional order. One of the fundamental principles of American democracy is that nobody is above the law, not even the president, not even a former president. But Trump has spent years testing that principle, pushing boundaries, defying subpoenas, ignoring court orders, claiming absolute immunity, arguing that presidents can't be prosecuted for anything they do while in office. And every time he gets away with it, every time a court gives him more time or more leeway, it erodes that principle a little bit more. But what happened in that courtroom was the opposite. It was a federal judge saying, "No, you don't get to behave this way. You don't get to disrupt my court. You don't get special treatment because of who you are." And that matters enormously for the long-term health of American institutions. Because if Trump had been allowed to continue his outburst, if the judge had just let it go because Trump is a former president and a major political figure, it would have sent a message that powerful people really can do whatever they want, that the rules don't actually apply to them. Instead, the judge enforced the rules, and that's a signal to everyone watching that the system still has some teeth, that there are still lines that can't be crossed, even by someone like Trump. 10th, let's talk about what happens next in the immediate term. The judge is going to rule on whether to hold Trump in contempt, and that decision is going to come fast, probably within days. If the judge does hold him in contempt, Trump will have the option to appeal, which he absolutely will, but appeals take time, and in the meantime, the contempt order stands. The judge could also decide to impose additional restrictions on Trump's behavior, possibly including requiring him to attend the rest of the trial via video link from a separate room so he can't disrupt the proceedings again. That would be humiliating for Trump, sitting in a side room watching his own trial on a screen, while the jury sees an empty chair at the defense table, but it's well within the judge's authority to order it. Trump's lawyers are going to try to smooth this over. They're going to file motions arguing that Trump was just exercising his First Amendment rights, or that the judge overreacted, but those arguments are not going to fly. You don't have a First Amendment right to disrupt a court proceeding. The judge has absolute authority to maintain order in his courtroom, and Trump just crossed a line that judges take incredibly seriously. And here's the problem that Trump and his team still don't seem to fully grasp. Every time Trump does something like this, he gives prosecutors and judges more ammunition to use against him. Every outburst, every violation of a gag order, every attack on a witness or a judge, it all goes into a file that prosecutors can point to when they're arguing for stricter conditions or harsher sentences. It all becomes part of a pattern that demonstrates Trump's contempt for the legal process. And in federal court, judges have long memories and very little patience for defendants who waste the court's time and disrespect the institution. Trump is burning through whatever goodwill he might have had with the judiciary, and he's doing it in a way that's going to make every single one of his remaining legal battles significantly harder to win. So here's the bottom line. What happened in that courtroom wasn't just a bad moment or a PR problem that Trump can spin his way out of. It was a fundamental breakdown in Trump's ability to control himself under the pressure of legal accountability, and it's going to have massive consequences across every dimension of his life. His legal cases, his political future, his fundraising, his standing with voters, his relationships with Republican officials who are tired of defending his chaos, and his credibility on the world stage. The image of Trump being escorted out of a courtroom by federal marshals is going to define this phase of his post-presidency, and it's not an image that conveys strength or leadership. It conveys exactly the opposite. It conveys someone who is out of control, someone who can't handle the basic requirements of being a defendant in a criminal trial, let alone the responsibilities of being president. Judges in every other Trump case are watching this and adjusting their approach accordingly. Prosecutors are watching this and building their arguments around it. Voters are watching this and making decisions about whether this is really the person they want representing them. And Trump's own legal team is watching this and realizing that their biggest obstacle to winning these cases isn't the evidence or the law, it's their own client. This story is far from over. The contempt hearing is coming. The trial is going to continue. The other cases are going to move forward. And every step of the way, Trump is going to have to live with the consequences of what he did in that courtroom, because that moment is now part of the permanent record, a vivid demonstration of what happens when someone who spent their entire life avoiding accountability finally has to face it. Keep your eyes on this case, because what happens next is going to set the tone for everything that follows in Trump's legal and political future, and it's not looking good for him.